It being 2 o'clock, questions on notice. The Leader of the the Prime Minister.
Just on ministerial representations, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I inform the House that the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment will be absent from question time today and for the remainder of the week. The Treasurer will answer questions on his behalf in the Trade, Tourism and Investment portfolio, and I'll answer questions on his behalf representing the Minister for Foreign Affairs. The Minister for Resources and Water will also be absent from question time today and for the remainder of the week, and the Deputy Prime Minister will answer questions on his behalf.
I thank the Prime Minister. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Nearly 2 years after COVID reached Australian shores, how many new federal quarantine facilities have opened?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition would be aware of the National Resilience Facility at Howard Springs, which has a capacity of 2,000, Mr Speaker, and that was indeed the facility that the most recent facilitated flights, where we've been running those flights to bring Australians home from around the world, and those flights that more recently, over the last few weeks, had come in from South Africa, Mr Speaker. There was the flights that went there, and the one case of Omicron, Mr Speaker, that had come up has been identified there, and they're in quarantine at that federally supported and funded facility.
The member for Mallee has the call.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government is taking action to keep Australians safe from threats such as Omicron COVID strain at home and abroad, and how the government is protecting Australians from faceless cowards online by holding social media giants to account for appalling online behaviour?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Mallee for her question. Our government, Mr Speaker, we have no more important responsibility than keeping Australians safe. And we face threats in the physical world, of course, Mr Speaker, threats of the instability of the region in which we live, the defence actions that we must take, Mr Speaker, the threats of terrorism. There are many threats, health threats and many others that we face in the physical world, but we also face those threats in the digital world as well, whether that's the threat of cyber attacks, Mr Speaker, or indeed those attacks that are made on Australians every day, anonymous attacks that are made online in a cowardly way, Mr Speaker. But in terms of health, we are responding, of course, to the most recent strain that has come, Mr Speaker, in relation to COVID, the Omicron strain. Now, we have had many of these variants, Mr Speaker, that have already come to Australia, and we've been able to address and deal with those. And in terms of Omicron, Mr Speaker, we are undertaking sensible, balanced and proportionate responses, working closely together with the states and territories. Tomorrow afternoon, evening, Mr Speaker, the Premiers, the Chief Ministers and I will be meeting together to update further and get the latest information on what is being brought forward on this most latest variant, Mr Speaker, that has been identified. We are listening, of course, to the best possible medical advice and evidence coming forward on this new strain, and the best encouragement, of course, that we can make to all Australians is 86.7% double-dose vaccinations, Mr Speaker. This is the strong protections that Australians have built up, and that continues to provide us with a strong preparedness to deal with these strains and these variants as they come. In the Solomon Islands, Mr Speaker, Australian boots are on the ground. 45 Australian Federal Police and 76 Australian Defence Force officers from the 3rd, 6th and 17th Brigade in Townsville, Mr Speaker. They are there on the ground restoring calm. They are there enabling our own Pacific family to be able to deal peacefully with the issues in their own country, Mr Speaker. And I welcome in particular the broader support we've had from both Fiji and Papua New Guinea and New Zealand in the response that we've made to ensure that we can provide for a peaceful environment for these issues to be resolved in the Solomon Islands. But I thank all of those who are there right now in a place, Mr Speaker, that has seen very serious civil unrest, and I thank all of their families as well, because they are going away weeks out from Christmas, Mr Speaker, but they're doing their duty. And when it comes to online safety, Mr Speaker, this government, Mr Speaker, is taking action, as we always have throughout the course of this government, Mr Speaker, to take action against the digital companies and the social media companies to ensure that Australians can be safe online. And the legislation we're bringing forward, Mr Speaker, will unmask the trolls. They'll unmask the trolls, Mr Speaker, and they will also ensure that digital media companies are held to account held to account, Mr Speaker,
Order.
for what is being done to young people,
The
particularly
Prime
women and
Minister's
girls
time
in
has
this country.
expired, and I give the call to the member for Hindmarsh.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why doesn't Australia have any new federal quarantine facilities to strengthen our defences against new variants? Why does the Prime Minister always go missing when he has a job to do?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And in response to the previous question from the Leader of the Opposition, I made it very clear that 2,000 space facility in the Northern Territory has been serving Australia extremely well. It's enabled Australians to come home from all around the world when Australians were coming back from parts of the world particularly impacted by the previous Delta strain. And now, Mr Speaker, those who are coming in facilitated flights out of southern Africa, Mr Speaker, they have been accommodated there in those federally supported facilities. The facilities in Melbourne are under construction, Mr Speaker, and there are also the facilities in Western Australia and in Queensland, Mr Speaker, which will be there not just in the near term, Mr Speaker, but for the longer term as well, to ensure that those facilities are there to deal with other pandemics, Mr Speaker, when they will inevitably come to this country. Mr Speaker, in this country, Australia has had one of the lowest fatality rates in the world in relation to COVID. Australia has also had one of the strongest economies amongst the advanced world, Mr Speaker, as we've pushed through COVID. And Australia also now has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, Mr Speaker. It was this government that closed the borders, Mr Speaker. It was this government that ensured that Australia was protected early on in the pandemic, Mr Speaker, and saved more than 30,000 lives working together with states and territories around the country to produce one of the best responses to COVID in the world. In the world, Mr Speaker. Those opposite may want to talk down the achievements of Australians in responding to COVID. We'll keep leading them through the COVID crisis.
The member for Cowper has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government is ensuring online safety and well-being of those who live in regional and rural communities, particularly young Australians? And is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Cowper for his question and note the work that he has done as a strong advocate for mental health, especially in his advocacy for the work for Fortum, which provides first responders like police, rural fire and SES, among others, with mental health wing and support. Mr Speaker, we note that in regional areas, especially in remote areas, the time that is spent online by people who haven't got other, especially young kids, haven't got other activities, can be more than the 14.4 hours a week, which is the average that people spend online. And we remember especially the tragic death of Dolly Everett, who took her own life at the age of 14 years old after being bullied online. Mr Speaker, the time has come for us to make sure that we do more to protect people and to assist especially parents and the trials and tribulations that come and in many instances with daughters who are online being bullied, being trolled, being persecuted by anonymous people, by people who go with names that protect their identity because they know full well that what they say is completely and utterly beyond the pale, because they know that what they say is tailored in such a way as to create hurt, and is there to create harm, and it is there to destroy people's lives, and in many instances it does. Mr Speaker, our nation spends billions of dollars on mental health, and a section of that is caused by the capacity for those who are online because it becomes as an addiction. People fight the phantoms, but they never win because the phantoms never declare themselves, and they make sport, and they make a disgusting sense, a disgusting mechanism of being satiated by the capacity to harm another person. This government must do something, and I hope that all governments around the world now do their part to bring these into line. It is not a matter of shutting down free speech. It is a matter of acting appropriately, and companies that make billions of dollars, have the capacity to write the code to better protect those who use their product, a product which at the same time divest the Fourth Estate of their advertising revenue and the process of proper investigatory journalism, which is so vitally important in maintaining a democracy. Mr Speaker, upstairs in the Fourth Estate here above the Senate, there's Fairfax, there's Channel 7, there's the ABC, there's overseas bureaus, but there is no room that is the report that is from where Facebook reports. This nation is going to stand up for those who remain vulnerable.
The member for Chifley has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. More than a year ago, Industry Minister number 6 out of the 8 industry ministers for this government announced Australia would be producing its own mRNA vaccines by now. Since then, there have been several announcements promising further announcements, and yet nothing has happened. Why not?
The Prime Minister has the
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and the Minister for Industry may wish to add to the answer. Mr Speaker, we've been progressing strongly with both discussions we've been having with CSL and Moderna in relation to the manufacturing of mRNA vaccines here in Australia. This is not a capability that other countries have, other than those who had it prior, Mr Speaker, to the commencement of this pandemic. And we're looking forward to those negotiations to now proceed to the next level. I've been having constructive discussions with premiers, Mr Speaker, about the support that they can provide also for this facility. This is an important capability, not just in relation to COVID vaccines, for which Australia is well supplied, and particularly in relation to booster shots, Mr Speaker, but the role that mRNA vaccines can play into the future. The suggestion by those opposite that this is something that could already been established here, Mr Speaker, is simply false. It's simply false, Mr Speaker, and we are progressing well with this initiative, working with those who have that capability, and we look forward to it being brought to Australia.
The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for offering me the opportunity to add to his answer. And of course, Australian manufacturer has already delivered 25 million vaccines, Mr Speaker. Delivered 25 million vaccines, and there's potential to manufacture many more. Now, this is all about making sure we have control over our own destiny, Mr Speaker, and that's why we're also, on top of those 25 million vaccines that have been manufactured in this country, developing a pathway to develop our own onshore manufacturing capability for mRNA. That has 2 core benefits, Mr Speaker. First of all, of course, it ensures us against future pandemics and indeed variants, as we're seeing now, but also it builds an industry capability and the jobs opportunity that comes with that, Mr Speaker. And we know we are well positioned to build capacity in this very high potential area of science. Now, Mr Speaker, to get the best deal for Australia—
The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Chifley.
Speaker, with respect, we don't need the background. Direct relevance. When is it happening? That is what I asked.
The member for Chifley will resume his seat. The Minister has the call. The Minister is being relevant.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. As I was saying, we're taking a 2-part approach. We're having discussions with Moderna, who manufacture one of only 2 approved mRNA products in the world. I've personally spoken with the head of Moderna and in Australia and the chief executive globally, Mr Speaker. And secondly, we approached the market for proposals from industry and are asking what support they would need from government. We're working through that process thoroughly now, Mr Speaker. Now, this is important for Australia, it's important for manufacturing, and it's an important part of ensuring that we can control our own destiny, Mr Speaker, and we're getting on with the job.
The member for Kennedy has the call.
Prime Minister, what action is being taken to secure national sovereignty over the only Panamax port facility in Northern Australia, Darwin? Has Australia already suffered a $39 billion punishment for expressing an opinion questioning COVID's origins? Is not China's Global Switch still holding national defence data, controlling and/or owning 43% of Australia's electricity industry and 100% of our solar electricity supply, a further 25% monopoly of solar electricity? 93% of our petrol and diesel is imported from Singapore and South Korea, countries beholden to China. What action national security, Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, and the Treasurer may wish to add to the answer in relation to the activities of the Foreign Investment Review Board, Mr. Speaker. But this government has introduced the strongest foreign investment rules, Mr. Speaker, of any government. And this government has said no, Mr. Speaker, to many proposals that we believe would compromise Australia's national security. And the ones that you refer to, Mr. Speaker, particularly the one that is referred to, Mr. Speaker, by the member in Northern Australia, is currently the subject of a further assessment being undertaken by the Department of Defence. Now, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to protecting our national security, what you have to be conscious of is that you have to be prepared to make the investments in your national security that can keep Australians safe. And that's why, as a government, we have overachieved when it comes to restoring our investment in our defence forces and their capability. More than 2% of our GDP, the size of our economy. We are now investing in our defence capability. In addition to that, we have restored the investments in the Australian Federal Police and our other security intelligence agencies so we can keep a close watch and take action wherever we need to, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that Australia is protected from whether it's the threat of organised crime, counter-terrorism, Mr. Speaker, and the emergence, as we've seen over the last many years, in relation to right-wing extremism and other forms of extremism in this country. Just last week, Mr. Speaker, we took the decision to list Hezbollah as a full terrorist organisation, Mr. Speaker, and this goes further to our resolve to address these issues of national security. We have taken strong stands against those who have sought to coerce us. We have said things and we have rejected decisions, Mr. Speaker, that they would have us to make. And we have stood up night and day, Mr. Speaker. We have called out the issues that need to be called out in our part of the world. We've worked closely with our partners and our allies to ensure that we have the capability to defend Australia's interests in our part of the world. And the AUKUS agreement, Mr. Speaker, has been one of the most significant, if not the most significant, working together with the United States and the United Kingdom to ensure that Australia is working with our closest partners and allies to have the capabilities we need to defend Australia, Mr. Speaker, defend Australia in the face of the instability we know to be present in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, it took our government, Mr. Speaker, to do that. It took our government to invest in our defence capability. It took our government, Mr. Speaker, to stand up to those who would seek to coerce us. We didn't have an each-way bet on national security on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. We have always stood up strongly to those who would seek to coerce. Others may wish to appease. Our government will always stand up to those who would seek to coerce Australia.
The member for Leichhardt has the call. Order.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House of how the Morrison government's proven commitment to cutting taxes for families and businesses will help strengthen the rebound of our economy on the other side of the COVID pandemic? And most importantly, is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Leichhardt for his question and acknowledge his experience as a crocodile farmer, Mr. Speaker, as a grazier, as a welder, as somebody who spent 9 years in the RAAF. Now, Mr. Speaker, he and others on this side of the House understand that the Australian economy has shown remarkable resilience. 350,000 new jobs have been created since the start of September, Mr. Speaker. And we've seen consumer confidence up and we've seen a strong pipeline of investment. And we're achieving this rebound in our economy at the same time as we're cutting taxes. So individuals on $60,000 a year, a teacher and a tradie, are $6,480 better off as a result of tax cuts which this side of the parliament has passed, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to small businesses, they're now paying the lowest taxes in 50 years. And when it comes to business investment incentives, we've seen a 20-year high in the growth of machinery and equipment investment off the back of our business investment incentives. Now, I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Well, we know that weak leader of the opposition, he came up with a national driver's licence. We know that weak leader of the opposition wants to remove the fuel excise on electric vehicles, even though there isn't an excise on electric vehicles.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business.
on direct relevance, to have a reference at the end of the question to other policies doesn't mean you can just have a complete rant like this.
Well, the question was, is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches rather than policies? The Treasurer is being relevant, and the Treasurer has the call.
And, Mr Speaker, we know that this weak Labor leader also wants to splash us $6 billion on people who've already had the jab. And we also know that if Labor is given half a chance on the Treasury benches, they will introduce higher taxes. And how do we know? Because when they were last in government, they gave us the mining tax and a carbon tax which doubled the electricity price, Mr Speaker. And then when they were in opposition, they railed against our income tax cuts, which the member for Rankin called offensive, Mr Speaker. And they were against our small business tax cuts, Mr Speaker. And then at the last election, they took to the Australian people $387 billion of higher taxes on your superannuation, on your housing, on your income, on your family businesses and on retirees, Mr Speaker. We know that this weak leader of the opposition will not stand up to the Greens. He will not stand up to the co-architects of 387.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. Point of order. It goes to the order of the House. It is not in order for the member to go for more than half of his 3 minutes just on a personal sledge.
Well,
it's got nothing to do with the question.
Leader of the Opposition will
Nothing to do
resume
with
his
it.
seat. The Treasurer was asked questions in relation to the cutting of taxes, strengthening the economy, and whether he is aware of any alternative approaches. I'm not in a position to determine whether the Treasurer should allocate a certain percentage of the question or his question time to certain aspects. Order. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, just to raise a question on the point you just made.
Yes.
If you're not in a position to deal with how much of a proportion of a question is dealt with different areas, how on earth are there rulings about preambles? How on earth have we had rulings about where you're in the first minute or someone's just started? It is the role of the Speaker to decide whether or not question time's used for ministers to be accountable on their portfolios.
Members on my right. The Treasurer is relevant, and I'll ask the Treasurer to return to the dispatch box. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, these are inconvenient truths for this weak leader of the opposition, and his shadow Treasurer, who's barely in the chamber and barely gets a question, Mr Speaker, because they only stand for one thing, that's higher taxes, that's less jobs.
The Treasurer's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Rankin.
Yeah, thanks very much, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How
Members on my right.
How many funds in his budget are allocated at the discretion of the minister, and what's their total value?
Members on my right. The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, there are various funds which are in the budget that provide grants across various important areas of the economy, Mr Speaker. But what I can tell the member for Rankin is we don't have a big bat scheme, Mr Speaker, that wastes $2.4 billion. We have important programs across the budget which provide for competitive grants processes.
The member for Higgins has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the—
Order. Member for Higgins has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please advise the House on how the Morrison government is responding to international developments in relation to the most recent COVID-19 variant of concern, Omicron, and what action is being taken to protect Australians?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Over the weekend, we know that the total number of cases around the world has increased to over 261 million cases and very sadly now almost 5.2 million lives lost officially. I want to thank the member for Higgins for her focus in this space as somebody with a lifetime's experience in healthcare and health policy. And what's absolutely clear is, against that background, Australia has had one of the lowest rates of loss of life in the world, one of the 3 lowest rates of loss of life in the OECD. We now have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, and after Israel, we are one of the first nations to have implemented a whole-of-nation booster program. The consequence of that is we now have over 92.3% Australians who've had a first vaccine, over 86.8% of Australians who've had a second vaccine, and 415,000 Australians that have had boosters. But we know that the WHO identified on Saturday, Australian time, a new variant of concern, the Omicron variant. As a response to that, the Australian government has taken the following steps. We have immediately banned flights coming from the 9 southern African nations where we have seen the cases of Omicron and the spread. We have sadly had to ban the arrival of non-Australians who have been in those countries. In addition to that, we have sought to make sure that all returning Australian citizens and residents and their dependents and immediate family who have been in those 9 countries in the last 14 days enter quarantine here in Australia. In addition to that, those rules have applied to those that are coming from travel bubbles. So all of these things are occurring in Australia. Today, the Prime Minister has taken it further and has commissioned a meeting of the National Security Committee of Cabinet this afternoon to review measures, to review progress. He has also commissioned a meeting of the National Cabinet, comprising the First Ministers of States and Territories, along with the Prime Minister. I have asked ATAGI, through the Secretary of Health, Professor Brendan Murphy, to consider the period for boosters, both in light of emerging international evidence and in light of anything which may come from Omicron. But what is important is that Professor Paul Kelly, the Chief Medical Officer, has pointed out on a number of occasions there is some evidence that this may be a milder variant. That is still to be determined, but that is an important sign, and the message to the House is we've got through this. We've protected Australians, but we'll continue to do so.
The Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Rankin.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer, and I refer to his previous answer. If he doesn't know how many funds in his budget are allocated at the discretion of the minister and their total value, will he provide this answer at the end of today's question time? Shouldn't the Treasurer know how much of his $1 trillion in debt he's borrowed to spray around marginal seats?
The Treasurer doesn't have the call yet. I haven't called the Treasurer yet. The Treasurer has the call.
So there are programs like Roads of Strategic Importance, the Bridges Renewals Program, Building Better Regions Program, the Black Spot Program, the Stronger Communities Program. I would ask that the Shadow Treasurer, he would actually go and inspect the
Members
budget
on my
papers,
left.
probably something that he hasn't had read, Mr
Gorton.
Speaker, because the reality is these various programs support the economy and have added Roads of Strategic Importance, the Bridges Renewal Program, the Building Better Regions Program, Stronger Communities, the Black Spot Program. What has the member for Rankin got against those programs?
The Treasurer has concluded his answer. The Treasurer has I'm sorry? I can't hear you when requesting for table. Is the Treasurer referring to a confidential document? The member for Rankin has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. I ask that the Treasurer table the document from which he was reading, and if not, will he provide the answer by the end of question time?
Is the Treasurer referring to a confidential document? The member for the Manager of Opposition Business. On a point of order.
I think the answer to the question that was just given by the Treasurer was that he was quoting from a publicly available document. No, but I think that's what he was saying. Understanding orders, unless it's a confidential document, he has to table it. No. And you asked him if it was a confidential document. If he's answered that it's not a confidential document, then he has to table it. That's what standing orders say.
I think the Manager of Opposition Business, the Treasurer did say he was referring to a publicly available document, but it was the budget papers that he was referring to, is what he said. No, he doesn't need to table it. If the Manager of Opposition Business wants to resume the dispatch box, if it's a publicly available document, then it doesn't need to be tabled. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. There have been many times when a Speaker, on the request that something be tabled, that the Speaker has intervened and said, I'm not even going to ask. But on every occasion, once the Speaker asks, was the minister quoting from a confidential document? If the answer is yes, then it doesn't have to be tabled. If the answer is no, it's not a confidential document, which is what the Treasurer said, then it must be tabled. That's how this parliament's always run.
I'm happy to hear from the Leader of the House. Leader of the House.
Speaker, well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the House will just wait one moment. Members on my left. Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I simply refer you to the ruling of Speaker Smith in relation to these matters, which is entirely consistent with the comments, the statements you've already made. It's a publicly available document, and on that basis it does not need to be tabled.
Yes, the ruling which I have said already, and that is that if it's a publicly available document, that it doesn't need to be tabled, is consistent with the rulings of the previous Speaker Smith. The member for Reid has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Order.
My question is to the Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts, representing the Attorney-General. Will the Minister please update the House on the Morrison government's strong stance on online safety, including yesterday's announcement to combat online trolls and strengthen defamation laws? Will the Minister advise on any industry feedback on our proposed new laws?
The Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for Reid, who of course has a long-standing personal and professional interest in this as a psychologist with very advanced qualifications and of course as a mum. And like all of us on this side of the House, and I'd suggest the entire chamber, we're very concerned about online safety, and the Morrison government has been at the forefront of delivering measures designed to give people the protection of the rule of law online just as they have it offline. We cannot accept a situation in which social media is used as a place where cowards use the shield of anonymity to bully, to harass and to ruin lives. And, Mr Speaker, that is why we have now announced the next stage, building on measures that this government's already delivered, like the world's first e-safety commission, legislation to deal with abhorrent violent material online.
The honourable member, the Minister will resume his seat. The member for Whitlam has the call.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
On a point of order.
Speaker, it goes to the operations of the House. When the Prime Minister was answering questions on online trolling before, the member for Bowman's screen was
active. The member for Whitlam will resume his seat. The member for Whitlam will resume his seat. Yeah, you haven't stated a point of order. The member for Whitlam. The member for Whitlam will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Well, Mr Speaker, that interjection was clearly disorderly. There was no point of order. It was a rant. And
Leader of the
if
House
there is a question to you, it should be at the end of
the Leader of the House will resume his seat. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, mate.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And of course, this year we passed the Online Safety Act, which will take effect in January. These are very serious issues, and it's quite disappointing to see the trivialisation that we're seeing from the member opposite, Mr Speaker, because we have now announced a bill which will give the victims of defamatory online comments the power to proceed against the person who made the comment through a complaint scheme operated by the social media platform, through alternatively federal courts having the power to issue an end-user information disclosure order requiring the platform to disclose details of the person who posted that comment so defamation action can be pursued. And, of course, Mr Speaker, central to what we are setting out is giving the social media platforms a very strong incentive to disclose this information by granting them a conditional defence against being liable in defamation if they have a complaint scheme in place and if they share the information. But if they don't, they will be held liable as a publisher, Mr Speaker. So we've been very clear on the principles and we've got a clear mechanism to deal with this problem. The Australian people are sick of anonymous trolls online conducting themselves with impunity, and we expect the platforms to do something about this, and that is why we have now come forward with this detailed and well-thought-through regulatory framework, and it's been widely welcomed. For example, the Managing Director of Publishing at Nine Entertainment, James Chessel, said, quotes, "Nine welcomes the government's announcement today, which will put responsibility for third-party comments made on social media pages with the person who made the comment or with the platforms if the platforms cannot identify the person." So, Mr Speaker, this government has delivered a series of effective reforms to make the online environment a safe place in which to operate, and with this very significant announcement over the weekend, we are continuing our work in this area.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. And I note it has now been more than 1,000 days since the Prime Minister stood next to the member for Pearce and announced a National Anti-Corruption Commission. It is the last week of Parliament for the year. Isn't the Prime Minister delaying legislation to ensure a National Anti-Corruption Commission won't be established this term?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, the member will be aware there's a 349-page legislation that the government has prepared in relation to the design of our proposal for a Commonwealth Integrity Commission. We have committed $150 million, Mr Speaker, in the budget to support it. Mr Speaker, this is the Labor Party's proposal. It's 2 pages. It's 2 pages, Mr Speaker. See, the government has a proposal for such a commission. The member for Indi has a proposal, Mr Speaker. The Greens have a proposal,
Members
Mr Speaker.
on my left.
The Labor Party have no proposal, Mr Speaker. They have absolutely no proposal on this matter. The government has a set of legislation that we have made available that has been carefully designed and consulted upon, and the Labor Party refused to support it. So, Mr Speaker, the government's position on an Integrity Commission is very clear. There's 349 pages of well-drafted legislation to back it up. The Labor Party has no such proposal, Mr Speaker, and no integrity on this issue.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. I'm seeking the call to seek leave to move a motion, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition.
I seek leave to move the following motion that the government table its legislation for a National Anti-Corruption Commission.
Is leave granted?
Leave is not granted.
Leave is not granted. The member for Longman. Order.
My question is to the Minister.
The member for Longman has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is taking a strong leadership role in assisting to restore public safety and rule of law in the Solomon Islands as part of our ongoing work to ensure a secure Pacific region in Australia's national interest?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Now, I think we would all agree in this place that Australia is a very proud leader within the Indo-Pacific region, and we will always work to support our Pacific neighbours during times of need. Now, our law enforcement agencies, in particular, take a very active role in assisting and working cooperatively throughout the region, and they have been doing that for a very long time. Now, the violence, the looting, the civil unrest that is currently taking place in Honiara has sadly led to a number of deaths, and it has resulted in very extensive property damage, and that is very concerning to us here. And it's very important to the people of the Solomon Islands that law and public order is restored as soon as it possibly can be. Now, we've made it very clear that our role in Australia is from Australia is not to involve ourselves in domestic political situations that are arising in the Solomon Islands. Our mission to the Solomon Islands is in fact very clear. We are there to work with the Royal Solomon Islands Police Force to do all that we can to restore the stability in the region and to protect people and critical infrastructure. Now, this is a very serious issue, and once again, as a government, we have taken very immediate and decisive action to support one of our closest neighbours. Now, yesterday, extra Australian Federal Police personnel landed at Honiara, taking the number of AFP on the ground to 70. And of course, there are ADF personnel on the ground as well as DFAT officers. Now, our AFP are uniquely positioned, having built a very strong working relationship with the Royal Solomon Islands Police Force over a number of years. Now, they're working very closely to assist the local police to restore order and to investigate the criminal conduct of the rioters that are there at the moment. Now, every Australian can be so proud of the fact that we have elite and specialist police officers who are ideally suited to help with such a complex and challenging situation as that exists in the Solomon Islands. They contribute far more than just mere numbers on the ground. They actually contribute a wealth of experience. So I would like to thank the members of the Australian Federal Police Force for the work that they do every single day to support us here in Australia, but for the work that they are doing in the Solomon Islands to support the police force there. I'd also like to thank the New South Wales Police Force, who have added to our presence on the ground in Honiara. Look, as a government, we will always do all that we can to support our neighbours in the Pacific region, and I do thank everyone who has participated so far in supporting the Solomon Islands.
The Leader of the Opposition on Indulgence.
Just briefly, Mr Speaker, I join with the Minister on behalf of the Australian Labor Party thanking the members of the Australian Federal Police, the Australian Defence Force for the work they're doing assisting in the Solomons, and we hope each and every one of them is able to return safely.
The member for Isaacs has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister's model of a National Anti-Corruption Commission have the power to investigate the Energy Minister meeting the Environment Department about an investigation into illegal poisoning of endangered grasslands on land in which he had a financial interest?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. I'll ask the Minister representing the Attorney-General to respond to that. I assume, Mr Speaker, that is one of the 9 frivolous referrals that were made by the questioner, Mr Speaker, and that were dismissed.
Mr Frivolous.
The member for Herbert has the call. Order. Order. The member for Herbert has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister inform the House on the Australian Defence Force's contribution to regional security in the Indo-Pacific?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. He was talking to me over the weekend about the troops who were deployed from Townsville to go to the Solomon Islands, and I know, like everyone in this House, he wishes them a safe trip, and the work that they're doing in the Solomon Islands obviously augments the work that the Minister for Home Affairs has just commented on with regard to the Australian Federal Police. It provides a security overlay, and it provides the ability to airlift and for people to safely be transported on some of the roads, Mr Speaker, in and out of Honiara. Obviously, as you'd be aware, the ADF personnel have come from 3, 17 and 6 brigades and 4 squadron from the RAF, and they've provided support including air combat controllers, the RE combat team, and further supporting elements. I want to say thank you to all of those personnel. Mr Speaker, it's a very significant effort that they're making, and obviously it follows a request from our near neighbours in the Solomon Islands. And I think what it does say, Mr Speaker, very clearly is that Australia will always be there in the Indo-Pacific, standing by our partners and our friends and our family in this part of the world to help them, particularly in their hour of need, and to make sure that we can see peace prevail in our region. Mr Speaker, one of the reasons that we're able to deploy so rapidly, and the RAF responded very quickly last week to incidents like this, whether it's a humanitarian disaster, a civil disorder, and under the bilateral security treaty that Australia has with the Solomon Islands, we are able to provide them with assistance. But the reason that we can do that so rapidly, and the reason that we are resourced so well within the Australian Defence Force, is that we've put significant additional funds into the ADF, Mr Speaker. Now, what would make it very difficult, as we knew under Labor's period in government, is that they reduced the amount of money that they put into the Australian Defence Force down to 1.5% of GDP, Mr Speaker. And the fact is that it's now up over 2%.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Deputy Manager, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
A point of order, Speaker. There's a certain dignity this answer should have, but there's also a question of relevance. No alternative proposition was asked for in the question.
That is correct. There was no reference to alternative approaches or policies. The Minister will be relevant to the question.
Mr Speaker, I'll tell you why it's essential to have strong leadership and to put the investment into the Australian Defence Force, which is exactly what this Prime Minister has done. Mr Speaker, we've done that because we wanted to restore the disaster that we inherited from the Labor Party, and we've been able to respond to this incident and to many more, Mr Speaker, because we have put the money into not just the acquisition of the equipment that they need, but also into the recruitment and the training of the Australian Defence Force personnel members,
The
Mr
Minister will
Speaker.
resume his seat. The Deputy Opposition Leader.
Yeah, well, this point of order now, Mr Speaker, is on the grounds that this is utter rubbish. They're the ones who stuffed the subs. They're the ones who have opened up the capability gap.
Deputy
This is the worst
Opposition
national
Leader will
security
resume his
government
seat.
now.
I've asked the Minister to remain relevant to the question based on my previous ruling. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The fact is that this government has and will continue to invest record amounts into the Australian Defence Force because, Mr Speaker, we are not weak on national security. We are strong on national security. We demonstrated through our actions, and the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, through their weakness, condemns their own actions.
Minister's time has expired. The member for Moreton is warned. The member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister's model of a National Anti-Corruption Commission have the power to investigate the purchase of land in the Leppington Triangle for 10 times its actual value?
The Minister has the call.
Well, I do thank the Shadow Minister for her question. The facts are, Mr Speaker, that our government has a well-developed model for a Commonwealth Integrity Commission. The full exposure draft of the bill underpinning our model is in the public domain and has been there for many months. We have committed $150 million of funding for our Commonwealth Integrity Commission, and we stand ready to proceed with the legislation should the Labor Party indicate that it wants to engage seriously on this matter rather than engaging in the kinds of cheap political stunts that we have heard from the Shadow Attorney-General and now the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure. We are getting on with engaging seriously with an important question of public policy, and we stand ready to introduce this legislation as soon as the Labor Party shows us that they are ready to work seriously on this and work with us.
Member for Shortland. Member for Shortland is warned. Order. The member for Moncrieff has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is committed to keeping Australian women and all Australians safe online?
The Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women, has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Moncrieff for her question and commend her on her leadership in her electorate with women and young girls. The Morrison government is committed to protecting Australians from online harms. This includes protecting them from harmful, defamatory comments made by online trolls. Mr Speaker, this is such an important piece of legislative reform. It will make a difference that really counts in a challenging and fraught public policy area when you consider the demands and pressures of the online world and how profoundly they are felt by younger women. Many of us in this place who were at school or were young women before social media became such a powerful and defining force in people's lives may need to remind ourselves that it is a different landscape that now exists when it comes to relationships and social interactions, and there is real hurt and damage being done by online trolls. As I said, Mr Speaker, this is critically important. If we think about how vulnerable women are in their teenage years and young 20s, of how vulnerable our daughters are now, how what your friends think about you, what your peer group thinks about you becomes your whole world, a world that can too easily come crashing down under the force of online trolling. Mr Speaker, to call it by its name, slut-shaming is one of the worst forms of cyberbullying, where young women are targeted on social media, they're bullied, they're humiliated because of the way they look, the way they dress, their presumed level of sexual activity. And how do you begin to take action against anonymous trolls who are motivated to destroy your reputation as a young, vulnerable woman? Well, these reforms will permit more Australians to seek redress for online harms, because anonymity should not be weaponised to abuse, harass, bully or damage a person's state of mind. And in some circumstances, social media companies will be expected to introduce mechanisms to allow those who post anonymous defamatory content to be identified with consent or with a court order. If anonymous trolls can't be identified, then social media companies could be liable in defamation or as publishers of that content under our proposed legislation. Mr Speaker, this is particularly important for Australian women because we know that women are the greatest targets of online abuse, with research showing that 1/3 of all Australian women had experienced abuse or harassment online. This needs to stop. I know that all sides of the House agree with this. The Morrison government is committed to keeping Australian women, and indeed all Australians, safe in the real world and safe online.
Just before I call the member for Sydney, I just wanted to make sure that the member for Hotham heard my warning earlier over the noise. Member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. What impact would the government's proposed controls on trolls on social media have on the reported online activities of the member for Bowman?
The Prime Minister has.
Well, Mr Speaker, the question may have asked for a legal opinion, Mr Speaker, and I will leave that within your ambit and your guidance, Mr Speaker. I can tell you what our laws do, Mr Speaker. What our laws do, and I note the jeers and the sneers, Mr Speaker, that have come against government speakers who have been speaking on this matter, including, Mr Speaker, the Minister representing the Minister for Women, Mr Speaker. Now, we believe this is a very serious issue. We believe this is an incredibly serious issue, Mr Speaker. I doubt there's a parent in this country that does not, on a nightly basis, have concerns about what their children are being exposed to online and the abuse and harassment that can take place. I know I feel that way as a parent, Mr Speaker. I know Jenny does, Mr Speaker, and I would think that every single parent in this place would. And so, Mr Speaker, this is a serious piece of legislation that the government is bringing forward.
The Manager of Opposition Business. On a point of order?
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. On direct relevance, because the points that the Prime Minister is making now are points that the House would agree with, but they're not relevant to the question. The question goes to the behaviour of one of the members of his own government and what impact the legislation will have there. There's no objection to what the Prime Minister is saying, but it's not relevant to this question.
The member for McCulloch is not being helpful. The Leader of the House. Happy to hear from the Leader of the House on this.
Mr Speaker, on the point of order, clearly the legislation, the proposal by the government, has equal applicability and it applies to all Australians equally. Somehow, for the legal opinion that is being sought by the honourable member opposite, there can be no expectation that the Prime Minister can offer an opinion on a particular matter, and therefore, Mr Speaker, I think the point of order made by the honourable member opposite is in fact not in order, and the Prime Minister is relevant, answering a wide-ranging question, and is completely in order.
The question does go to the impact of the bill or the policy in relation to specifically the member for Bowman, which in effect does call for a legal opinion. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, Mr Speaker, just to that point of order regarding a legal opinion, I'd refer you to page 558 of practice, which, where it deals with legal opinions, refers to the interpretation of the statute or of an international document. It does not refer to proposed legislation.
The Manager of Opposition Business is quite right about that point. However, the question also calls for a matter of opinion then, whether it may not necessarily be a legal opinion because it's not a bill, but is still asking for an opinion as to what impact or what effect the policy would have specifically in relation to the member for Bowman. I'll allow the Prime Minister to continue his answer.
Speaker, the legislation we'll be bringing forward means that everybody should identify themselves online, Mr Speaker, when they're making statements or they're making posts. And they should be accountable for that, Mr Speaker, and that applies right across the country. And where the social media companies do not identify that individual, Mr Speaker, they will be identified as the publisher. That is what our bill does. That is what our proposed remedy is, Mr Speaker, and it builds on the world-leading work that has been done in the Online Safety Act, Mr Speaker, the work that has been done to combat the use of the internet by terrorists, Mr Speaker. It builds on the work done by the world's ever-first e-safety commissioner. All of the work we're doing here is to stand up for Australians who are at risk in the online environment. And those who are most at risk, Mr Speaker, are our young people and our women, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, I would hope that this would have bipartisan support. I would call for it to have bipartisan support, Mr Speaker, and not be used in the typical political games playing that we get from the opposition. And this is a very serious issue, Mr Speaker, and I would have thought the Labor Party would have been only too quick to support it, but it would seem that that doesn't seem to be the case by the jeers and the interjections we've had on this matter today.
Just before I call the member for Lindsay, just the Manager of Opposition Business stated that the illegal opinion doesn't apply unless it's a statute. Well, it goes further than that. Legal opinions such as the interpretation of a statute or of an international document or of a minister's own powers should not be sought in questions. So it is further than just in relation to legislation. The member for Lindsay has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Special Minister of State,
and Minister assisting the Prime Minister and Cabinet. What are the next steps for implementing the national strategy to prevent and respond to child sexual abuse? And how will it raise awareness of child sexual abuse and help victims and survivors?
The Special Minister for State has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for their question. Sadly, child sexual abuse in Australia is growing, Mr Speaker. Between 2014 and 2019, the number of recorded sexual assaults against children and young people recorded by police increased by 21%. Now, percentages can tell you part of the story, Mr Speaker, but that increase is from 13,353 to 16,140 individual reports. Also, online reports of child abuse during April and June 2019 to April and June 2020 increased by 122%. The Prime Minister launched in October the National Strategy to Prevent and Respond to Child Sexual Abuse. That strategy has been endorsed by government leaders from all of the states and territories. The consultation that went into that strategy commenced in 2018 and built on the Royal Commission findings. This strategy is a 10-year whole-of-government approach to preventing and better responding to child sexual abuse in all settings. The strategy will focus on education, supporting victims and survivors, enhancing national responses to children with harmful sexual behaviours, offender prevention and intervention, and additional support for evidence and research. I'm pleased that the strategy has been welcomed by those in the sector. Dr Michael Salter, who's the Associate Professor for Criminology from the University of New South Wales, said that the national strategy is values-driven. It's practical, incorporating cutting-edge evidence and policy design to prevent abuse before it occurs and promotes the rights and well-being of survivors. It is the most comprehensive plan to tackle child sexual abuse in Australia's history and will set a global benchmark. Hetty Johnson, the founder of Braveheart, said that all that knowledge gained from the Royal Commission powerfully wrapped up in digestible actions for organisations and people everywhere, so it never happens again. Over the coming months, the National Office of Child Safety will establish formal stakeholder consultation mechanisms in relation to the rollout of the strategy. They will have a strong focus on engaging with victims and survivors and hearing from priority groups who are disproportionately impacted by child sexual abuse. The National Office will also engage with those in the not-for-profit sector and non-government stakeholders, including government stakeholders at a state and territory level, to develop targeted resources for all priority groups. This is important work of this government. I know it's supported by those opposite. It's supported by all the territory and state governments, and it's important that those victim survivors that provided evidence to the Royal Commission know that we are getting on with this important work.
The member for McMahon has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The government signed up to the COP26 request for countries to strengthen their 2030 targets by the end of 2022. But just hours later, the government said its 2030 target was fixed. Why did the Prime Minister tell the world one thing and then tell the Australian people the exact opposite?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the member's question is not telling the truth, Mr Speaker. What the COP26 arrangement was is members were invited to look at these things, Mr Speaker, and that's all we agreed to do, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Members on my left, if they weren't interjecting, could probably hear the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has... Order. Order. The Prime Minister has the call.
So thank you, Mr Speaker. The member who's asked the question has misrepresented what occurred at COP26, Mr Speaker. They can't just bend it to suit their political sledges, Mr Speaker, and to try and pursue the political games they so much enjoy and love in this place, Mr Speaker. And so what was put forward by the member is just incorrect, Mr Speaker. We have a 2030 target, Mr Speaker. We have a plan to achieve that 2030 target. We have a 2050 target, Mr Speaker, and we have a plan to achieve that target. Mr Speaker, those opposite don't have a 2030 target. They don't have a plan to achieve that target. They don't have a plan to achieve even their 2050 target, Mr Speaker. And like with so many things before this next election, Mr Speaker, they are a vacant space. And so all the Australian people can assume is what they did at the last election. What they did at the last election, Mr Speaker, which was to have targets, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Well, unsurprisingly, it's on direct relevance, Mr Speaker. There's nothing about alternatives in the question, and the entire answer is about alternatives.
The question goes to the government's policy in relation to COP26, strengthening targets. The Prime Minister has the call. I would ask the Prime Minister to remain relevant to the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So the projection that we've provided to COP26 is that we will have a 35% reduction in emissions on our 2005 levels. Already we're at 20.8%, Mr Speaker, below our 2005 levels, which exceeds so many other countries like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Mr Speaker, Japan, Korea and many more, Mr Speaker. The Australian achievement on reducing our emissions, particularly for economies such as ours, that has occurred at the same time we've seen one of the largest expansions of our LNG industry, Mr Speaker, the largest, in fact, we have seen in our LNG, Mr Speaker, than at any other time. So our government is delivering on reducing emissions, but at the same time ensuring that we're seeing electricity prices fall, Mr Speaker, because our policy is about technology, not taxes. Those opposite are interested in taxes. We're interested in technology, Mr Speaker. They reject our policy, which is for technology, not taxes. That's what our policy is. They're not for that. Our policy is for people to have choices, not being told to do what to do by the government, Mr Speaker, when it comes to what they want to buy and what they want to drive, Mr Speaker. That's our policy. We want choices, not mandates. Those opposite are opposing our policy. Our policy is to have a portfolio of technologies, whether it's hydrogen, Mr Speaker, or carbon capture, use and storage. And we want to see the funds from ARENA, Mr Speaker, and the other important government programs that can invest, Mr Speaker, in these. And those opposite, the Labor Party, are against it because they voted against carbon capture and storage, Mr Speaker. So to all of those up in the hunter, all of those who work in the aluminium sector, Mr Speaker, all of those who work in the minerals industry, the Labor Party voted against us
Prime Minister's
spending
time
resources
has expired.
on...
The Prime Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Parkes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia, representing the Minister for Emergency Management and National Recovery and Resilience. Will the Minister please outline the arrangements the Morrison-Joyce government has in place to ensure we are well prepared for floods, bushfires and other natural disasters this season?
The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Parkes for his question and also acknowledge not only his leadership but also the member for Riverina, particularly over the last week and I suspect coming into this week as further forecasts are showing significant rainfall hitting northern New South Wales. And we won't just see houses inundated with water. We have already seen millions of dollars wiped off this year's winter crop, a crop that was there to help those farmers that have endured drought to rebound. And sadly, we will continue to work with the New South Wales government in monitoring that, in quantifying the damage that's there and work with them constructively, as we have in Queensland already this year and in South Australia and Victoria. And that was the premise in which this government has worked after the bushfires of last year to ensure that we had a national approach. That's why we stood up the National Recovery and Resilience Agency on the 1st of July, to make sure that we had a coordinated approach, that we have people on the ground to be able to get around kitchen tables and work with those that have been impacted around with them and understanding not just federal programs but also state programs, so no one falls through the cracks. We've also stood up the Climate Services Australia, which is pivotal in bringing together the data and information from 10 agencies, whether that be the Bureau of Meteorology, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, CSIRO, Geoscience Australia, so that we have real-time data that we can not only provide to emergency service personnel and ensuring they understand the gravity of the threat, but also ensuring that we're prepared and ready for the immediacy after the threat has dissipated, that we can get people in to those areas and respond appropriately between federal and state agencies. Never been done before, and this is an important step in protecting Australians into the future. We're also supporting that through the ERF, and in fact the $50 million that has gone in to flood mitigation projects from last year, $17.2 million, has gone to jurisdictions, and I can inform the House that the balance of that, taking up to $50 million, will go out over the next couple of weeks as jurisdictions satisfy the requirements of that. And in fact, we'll reopen again for this year so that $50 million into mitigation works are out there. We're also doing the Rebuilding Australia, the $600 million that are going into projects, $400 million into community projects to build the resilience, whether that be a levy bank around a large community to not only protect them but to drive down insurance costs. And we're also working with households. We've already done that in Queensland in supporting households and partnering with them to try and do improvements to their homes that will improve their resilience, whether it be from a cyclone or from a flood or from bushfire. We're undertaking practical measures to support, partnering with states, understanding this is a joint partnership in protecting Australians now and into the future.
The member for Eden-Monaro.
Thank you, and my question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister claimed his emergency response fund would fund immediate response activities up to $200 million every year. But the Prime Minister spent nothing for more than 2 years and has only recently spent the first $17 million. With people in my electorate still living in caravans and parts of New South Wales now flooded, why didn't the Prime Minister use the money for immediate response activities like he said he would?
The Prime Minister has the
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Eden-Monaro for her question and the very serious issue of providing support to constituents as a result of those bushfires. And the answer to the question is because we have already provided $1.7 billion, Mr Speaker, from the National Bushfire Recovery Fund that has been delivered to locally led efforts on the ground. And that includes $350 million for the local economic recovery projects in impacted communities, which includes those in the member's electorate, but also in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia, and is funding to support a range of mental health assistance and counselling, small business advice, hardening telecommunications infrastructure and primary producer assistance. The $280 million Black Summer Bushfire Recovery Grants program is also assisting communities directly impacted by the Black Summer bushfires to address remaining priority bushfire recovery and resilience needs, and applications for that opened on the 22nd July of 2021. The Emergency Response Fund, Mr Speaker, was to be there where there wasn't other funds available. We created those extra funds, and we did that during the middle of the fires themselves, Mr Speaker, and that allocation of funding was made. As I said, $1.7 billion has been provided, and we will continue to provide that support, Mr Speaker. The Emergency Response Fund is drawn on where there is a need for support in addition to the funding that is already available, but I made it very clear to our government, Mr Speaker, that we would continue to provide those resources that were needed for what was then the Bushfire Recovery Agency, is now the agency led by the Honourable Shane Stone, Mr Speaker, that has people on the ground working with people to ensure that they can get the support they need. One of the most important of those, as the member will recall, and I thank the state member for Bega, Mr Speaker, the state member for Bega, Mr Constance, Mr Speaker, who worked very closely with me, Mr Speaker, to ensure that the Small Business Grants program, Mr Speaker, the Small Business Grants program was able to be more responsive to the needs on the ground. We worked together on that program, and I know he was very pleased that we'll be able to deliver that support on the ground. So $1.7 billion delivered already on the ground directly, with more funds still to follow, because the recovery effort takes time, as the minister in the previous answer to the last question indicated. It is very important that we're in there for the long haul, and there will continue to be hundreds of millions of dollars that will continue to flow to these affected communities as they are building back, Mr Speaker, and building their resilience for the future.
Member for Eden-Monaro. The member for Wentworth has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health and Minister
assisting the
Member
Minister for
Bruce
Trade and
is
Investment.
warned.
Will the Minister please update the House on Australia's contributions to COVID-19 vaccination efforts in the Pacific?
Order. 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 The Minister for Regional Health has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Wentworth for his question and acknowledge his stellar career as a diplomat before looking after the people of Wentworth. The Morrison-Joyce government stepped up immediately with the COVID-19 pandemic, supporting vaccine rollout and other health support across the Asia-Pacific. There has been $750 million worth of direct support into the Pacific and Asia, initially with PPA, health technology support and skills, but we also made a 60 million dose of vaccine commitment to our Asia-Pacific neighbours. And we have sourced 9.2 million doses of those vaccines from our own production, including 2.3 million doses across our Pacific family of nations. There's been over 1 million doses delivered in Fiji alone, but there's also been support with distribution, training, planning support, AUSMAT teams where required, as well as facilitating national rollout programs. We've delivered marketing and sleeves-up information campaigns and engaged with community leaders in the islands and in the Pacific, working with their companies and addressing vaccine hesitancy amongst many of the islands' health workers. There are a huge amount of vaccines running around the Asia-Pacific courtesy of the COVAX facility, to which Australia has also contributed. In fact, there's $130 million worth of support to deliver 100 million vaccines across the Pacific. So what I can say to our Pacific family of nations and friends is that we stand with them, we're keen to support them, get through this pandemic, get international trade and travel and tourism going again, and to kickstart their regional economies again. So Australia stands ready to help. We have helped and will continue to help our Pacific family into the future.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
While the Treasurer is still in the room, Mr Speaker, I have a question for you while the Treasurer is still here. As I raised with you during question time, practice says if a minister quotes from a document relating to public affairs,
Manager of Opposition Business,
a member may ask
the Manager
for it to
of
be
Opposition
presented.
Business. I'll just get you to start the question again.
Well,
once.
that means that he's gone and the document's gone with him.
I can't hear you when the Manager of Opposition. Order on my left. Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, I'll quote from Hansard relevant to whether the Treasurer should have tabled a document that is now taken from the House, as I provided to you during question time. Page 510 of practice says this: if a minister quotes from a document relating to public affairs, a member may ask for it to be presented to the House. The document must be presented unless the minister states that it is of a confidential nature. This rule does not apply to private members. I put to you, Mr Speaker, that the Treasurer did not state that the document was of a confidential nature. He stated the exact opposite and then refused to table it, which is in breach of a very clear statement in practice.
The Leader of the House on this point. I thank the Manager of Opposition Business. I have dealt with that issue already. Members on my left. I have dealt with that issue. The Leader of the House.
Very much, Mr Speaker. Documents are tabled in accordance with the list circulated to honourable members earlier today. Full details of the documents will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.
The Leader of the House.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I present a chart showing the program of sittings for 2022. Copies of the program have been placed on the table. I ask leave of the House to move that the program be agreed to.
the Manager of Opposition Business.
That's leave to move the motion, is that right? That you're seeking? Yeah, leave's granted.
I thank the Manager of Opposition